are overflowing. We need to grab 2 more.
Awesome. We'll put those on either side.
We have all month to fill these up.
Don't forget, only plastic, peanut butter, and jelly jars.
So, boys and girls, here is your challenge. We have 2 full boxes of peanut butter and jelly, but we have 2 empty boxes on either side now. So we need you, let's point to them, we need you to fill up the other 2 boxes. And remember, you have the whole month of April. So we're counting on you, Bobcats. We know you can do it.
Good morning, Bobcats, and welcome to WBLS Morning News. I'm Colton, Millard from Miss Connor's 3rd grade class. Thank you for joining me this morning. I will be your guest anchor this week. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
This land is your land, this land is my land, from California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. As I was walking that ribbon of highway, I saw above me that endless skyway. I saw below me that golden valley. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land, this land is my land, from California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me. I've roamed and rambled and followed my footsteps to the sparkling sands of her diamond deserts, and all around me a voice was sounding. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land, this land is mine, from California to the New York Island. Yes, this land is your land, this land is mine. I know that this land was made for you and me. When the sun goes shining and I was strolling, and the wheat fields waving and the dust clouds rolling, and the birds were chanting as the fog was lifting. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land, this land is mine. From California to New York Island, Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me.
Today is Thursday, April the 13th. It is Special Area Day 6. Let's take a look at our weather forecast for today. We will have cloudy skies today with a high of 78 degrees and a low of 61 degrees. I wonder what's cooking in the Buck Lake cafeteria today. Today you will have your choice of corn dog minis or turkey ham and cheese pocket. For sides, you may choose green beans or sweet and spicy potatoes. You can choose 100% fruit juice or fresh Florida fruit. As always, you can have your choice of white chocolate or strawberry milk. A very happy birthday today. We want to wish one cool kindergarten teacher, Miss Darden, a very happy birthday. We hope you have an amazing day. We also want to wish Louie and Miss Fredrio's class a happy birthday. Make sure and wish these Bobcats a happy birthday if you see them. Here's a kindness quote for today. There are 3 things in human life that is important. The first is to be kind, the second is to be kind, the third is to be kind. It's peanut butter and jelly time. Bring in your plastic peanut butter and jelly jars and put them in the guidance office. Here's a few jokes to tickle your funny bone. Do you want to hear a secret joke about peanut butter jelly? Never mind, you might spread it. Why did the surfer put peanut butter on his surfboard? To go with the jellyfish. Well, that's all for today, Bobcats. Remember to be prepared, be upstanding, and be responsible, and always be respectful. And in case we don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.
Hi, Bobcats. So excited to be bringing you our third 9 Weeks Awards. I know that all of our Bobcats have been working very, very hard, and it is exciting to be able to celebrate some kids who have been putting forth their best effort and showing great leadership. Remember that if your name's not called in this video, it's okay. You have another opportunity to work really hard during the fourth 9 weeks. Let's find out who our award winners are. Our first category is leadership. These are students that are doing a great job in the classroom and setting a great example for their classmates. In pre-K, Miss Ishley's class, we have Avery. In Miss Darden's class, Cohen. Miss Gregory's class, Creashy. Mrs. Kerner's class, Brenna. Mrs. Lazarus's class, Chloe. Mrs. Munoz's class, Court. Mrs. Shank's class, Zoe. And from Miss Bergman's class, Jackson. Great job, guys. In first grade, from Miss Howell's class, Nicholas. From Mrs. McLeod's class, Liberty. From Mrs. McDermott's class, William. From Mrs. Oschlager's class, Wesley. From Miss Shively's class, Camille. From Mrs. Stark's class, Jackson. And from Mrs. Threadgill's class, Owen. Our leaders in second grade are, from Mrs. Dameron's class, Sylvie. From Mrs. Davis's class, Jacqueline. From Miss Hurley's class, Chloe. From Mrs. Furman's class, Peyton. From Mrs. Register's class, Nathan. And from Miss Williams's class, Jace. In third grade, we have from Mrs. Connor's class, Amelia. From Mrs. Ferris's class, Aaron. From Mr. Jones's class, Ariana. From Mrs. Schmidt's class, Cole. From Mrs. Tucker's class, Blake. From Mrs. Bix's class, Savannah. And from Mrs. Widener's class, Daisy. We have some leaders in fourth grade. From Mrs. Craven's class, Hadley. From Miss Ganaway's class, Evelina. From Mr. Lassiter's class, Hannah. From Mrs. Picnic's class, Mason. From Mrs. Ryan's class, Gideon. And from Mrs. Wells's class, Gunner. In fifth grade, from Mrs. Akos's class, Lila. From Miss Bowie's class, Harper. From Mrs. Duricky's class, Alyssa. From Mrs. Doherty's class, Victoria. And from Mr. Griffith's class, Dresden. Great job, fifth grade. Our next category is Best Effort. The students receiving these awards are students that persevere, they give their best effort even when things get tough. From pre-K, we have Henry. In kindergarten, from Mrs. Darden's class, Rex. In Miss Gregory's class, Dylan. In Mrs. Kerner's class, Milan. From Mrs. Lazarus' class, Camille. From Mrs. Munoz's class, Brianna. And from Mrs. Shank's class, Schloke. In first grade, from Mrs. Howell's class, Avery Kate. In Mrs. McLeod's class, Maura. In Mrs. McDermott's class, Briella. In Mrs. Oschlager's class, Abel. In Miss Shively's class, Gabriel. In Mrs. Stark's class, Jordan. And from Mrs. Threadgill's class, Cecilia. In second grade, our students showing great effort are from Miss Dameron's class, Caroline. In Mrs. Davis's class, Camila. In Miss Hurley's class, Riker. In Mrs. Furman's class, Bodie. In Mrs. Register's class, Chloe. And in Miss Williams' class, Maya. In third grade, from Mrs. Connor's class, Yassine. In Mrs. Ferris's class, Ben. In Mr. Jones's class, Maya. In Mrs. Schmidt's class, Sawyer. In Mrs. Tucker's class, Rebecca. In Mrs. Vix's class, Cash. And in Mrs. Widener's class, Calvin. Our students in fourth grade being recognized for their effort are from Mrs. Craven's class, Jason. From Miss Ganaway's class, Nina. From Mr. Lassiter's class, Jordan. From Mrs. Picnic's class, Tommy. From Mrs. Ryan's class, Hayden. And from Mrs. Wells's class, Eva. In fifth grade, from Mrs. Akos's class, Tyler. From Miss Bowie's class, Maddie. From Mrs. Duricky's class, Emma. From Mrs. Doherty's class, Elijah. From Mr. Griffith's class, Uriah. And from Miss Bergman's class, Jonathan. Our last category is Best Effort in Special Area. And our special area teachers have a really hard time selecting just one student from each grade level. Best effort in PE goes to, from kindergarten, Dean in Miss Lazarus's class and Bryson from Mrs. Kerner's class. First grade, Cardi in Mrs. Threadgill's class and Nawal in Miss Stark's class. In second grade, Keegan in Mrs. Furman's class and Ella in Miss Williams' class. In third grade, Ben from Mrs. Ferris's class and Reagan from Mrs. Vicks's class. In fourth grade, Samuel in Mrs. Picnic's class, Centonio in Miss Bergman's class, and Pahal from Mr. Lassiter's class. In fifth grade, we have Sloan from Mrs. Akos's class and Jordan from Miss Pooey's class. In art, from kindergarten, we have Kevin from Mrs. Darden's class. In first grade, Jaden from Miss Howell's class. In second grade, Fisher from Mrs. Register's class. In third grade, Willow from Mrs. Ferris's class. In fourth grade, Sasha from Mrs. Craven's class. And in fifth grade, Emma from Mrs. Doherty's class. Best effort in music goes to, from kindergarten, Cameron and Miss Gregory's class. In first grade, Levi in Mrs. McDermott's class. In second grade, Ethan in Miss Dameron's class. In third grade, Merrill from Mrs. Tucker's class. In fourth grade, Helen from Mrs. Ryan's class. And in fifth grade, Brooke from Mr. Griffith's class. Best effort in media goes to, from kindergarten, Mila in Mrs. Munoz's class. In first grade, Gloria in Mrs. Threadgill's class. In second grade, Dominic in Miss Hurley's class. In third grade, Mary Alice in Mrs. Tucker's class. Fourth grade, Peyton in Miss Ganaway's class. And in fifth grade, River from Mr. Griffith's class. Best effort in guidance goes to, from kindergarten, Maxwell in Mrs. Munoz's class. First grade, Jackson in Mrs. Stark's class. And second grade, Redhika in Mrs. Davis's class. Best effort in STEM goes to, in third grade, Lawson in Mrs. Vicks's class. Fourth grade, Ryan in Mrs. Wells's class. And fifth grade, Trenton in Mrs. Doherty's class. Great job, Bobcats. I know that you guys are working super hard, and it's great to be able to recognize you for your efforts. We've got one more 9 weeks left in this school year. Let's keep up the good work, and let's see who will be next to be recognized. Have a great day.